Go ahead and get started, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a second loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. For the hastening in the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Inshallah, everyone is doing well. We were going to continue with our discussion regarding the dunya and the value that the dunya has in the eyes of the Quran and Hadith. We have been discussing this topic for a number of weeks, and today we won't spend so much time on what Quran and Hadith have to say about the dunya itself. This is something that we've already gone through. We went through multiple verses of the Quran. We went through multiple ahadith, many of them very short ahadith, that really wrap up the whole dunya in a sentence or two. And they tell you basically that this world is smaller than what we assume it is. The importance of it is less than what we are told it is. And we were also told in the ahadith that the one who runs after this dunya, the dunya will run away from him. And the one who takes a moment to stop, and takes a moment to stop running after the dunya, he starts running after the akhirah, he starts worrying about what he's actually supposed to worry about, then the dunya will come to him. The dunya will stop running away from him. This is essentially where we ended our discussion in our previous session. And the question that we raised, for those who remember, was that if we have these ahadith, and they're not one or two, there's multiple ahadith of this nature, that if you run after the dunya, if you try to work too hard to try to grab the dunya, when I say working hard, I don't mean just putting in effort, that you're supposed to do. I mean losing sleep over it, being worried about it, being concerned about it, being willing to do haram things in order to get your hands on the pleasures of this dunya. That's what I'm referring to. We said if the ahadith tell us that if you run after the dunya like this, the dunya will run away from you. But that doesn't make sense though, because when we look around us, when we look in society, we find people who ran after the dunya, and it seems like they caught up with the dunya pretty well. It seems like they were running after the dunya, and the dunya didn't run away from them. They caught up with the dunya. In other words, they are benefiting from the pleasures of this world. They are benefiting from the luxuries that life has to offer, whether it's a house they're living in, the type of transportation that they have, the education that they get, the education that their children get, for example, the type of friendships that they can build, relationships that they can build. There's no doubt that all of these are at a higher level the higher you move up in class in society, the higher you move up in wealth in society. There's no doubt about that. And of course, the country that we live in is one of the worst countries when it comes to the distribution of this wealth and the distribution of these opportunities, where you will see those who are at the very, very top, and then you will see a huge percentage of the population being at a huge distance from them. And the wealth distribution that we have here obviously is a serious problem, which is deeply rooted in a number of different issues. So you look at people in society and you find that they ran after the dunya. It seems like they caught up with the dunya. Why is it that when we come to Quran and Hadith, they tell us that, listen, if you run after the dunya, there's no guarantee, and then in some ahadith it says you won't catch up with the dunya will run away from you. But then you look at different people, you look at celebrities, you look at CEOs, for example, you look at different people, you find that it seems as though they caught up with the dunya. It seems as though they are being showered with the blessings of this dunya. It seems as though they are essentially swimming in the luxuries that this world has to offer. This was a question that we raised in one of our previous sessions that we didn't get a chance to really address. And I want to address that, and then we're going to move on to how you treat people of the dunya, meaning how you're supposed to treat people who are only important because they are rich, who are only important because they have wealth, who are only important because they have social status. What is your approach supposed to be towards them? And then on the flip side, what is the approach that you are supposed to have to people who are very good people? They have very good hearts, but their social status is a low social status. Financially, they are struggling. What is your approach supposed to be as it relates to both of these two groups as well? So to answer this question, if I run after the dunya, if I see someone running after the dunya, and then I look at his life, and his life seems to be a very pleasurable life, how is that compatible with what I see in the Quran and Hadith telling me that if I run after the dunya, I'm not going to be able to catch up with it? The Quran and Hadith, when they speak about you running after the dunya from the perspective of Quran and Hadith is not just a house, it's not just a car, it's not just the wealth that you have, it's not just the relationships you have. That's not what really constitutes the dunya. What constitutes the dunya are the pleasures that you derive from these things. You have a house, but that house is not a dunya for you unless you actually take pleasure in it, right? That you have a car, but if that car you have an accident in it, that's not considered an example of the dunya from the perspective of Quran and Hadith. Quran and Hadith are speaking about the pleasures of the dunya. Yes? How you use the dunya, and from it you derive the different pleasures. And how some people, they get so busy with these pleasures that they forget about the akhirah. So when Quran and Hadith are talking about the dunya, they're not talking about objects necessarily. They're talking about that pleasure that you are seeking through the object. A person who runs, this is the answer to the question, a person who runs after the dunya, this person, does he get his hands on these objects? Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. His bank account is 10 times the bank account that I have. The numbers, the zeros in that bank account, 10 times the zeros that I have in my bank account. So there's no doubt about that. There's no denying that. This is a person who ran after the dunya and got his hands on these objects. He has a bigger house, he has a better car, he has multiple cars, he has a whole collection of cars. So he got his hands on all of these things. But that's not what Quran and Hadith are talking about though. They're talking about the pleasure this person was trying to derive from these objects. Did he actually reach the pleasure that he had in mind when he was trying to acquire these objects or not? That's a question that even you should be able to understand and answer. And the answer is no. We see this. You and I see this. People who went to acquire these objects, yes, they got the objects, but that wasn't the whole point to begin with. It wasn't the object. The whole point was to have a big house so that they could derive a pleasure from it. The whole point was to have a collection of cars so that they could derive a pleasure 10 times greater than the one who only has one car. The pleasure was the whole point. That's why you get a big house. That's why you add up to your wealth. That's why you add to your cars. That's why you do this, because there's a pleasure you're going to derive from them. Did this person actually get his hands on that pleasure though? That's the question. And then when you observe the life of a person like this, you will find many times you are taking more pleasure in your life than that person is. He got his hands on a number of objects, there's no doubt about it. He's got bigger house, bigger car than you can even imagine. But does he take in to the extent that his house is bigger, does that mean necessarily the pleasure he derives from his house is bigger now, is greater now? No, not necessarily. Why? Because the dunya, from its essence, is limited. We talked about this. They asked the Prophet, they asked the Ahlul Bayt, why do you call the dunya dunya? They said, because ad-dunya daniyatun, because it's low, it's limited. When it's limited, whatever they give to you in this world, because it's limited, after a little bit of time, you get bored of it. After a little bit of time, it turns into your new normal. When it turns into your new normal, the difference between your normal and the normal of a person who has one car versus a person who has 10 cars, their normals are the same normal. They don't take different levels of pleasure. Even though this one has 10 cars, this one has one car, this one car is the normal for him, this 10 cars is normal for him. His blood sugar doesn't, all of a sudden hit the sky when he has his 10 cars. Why? Because having 10 cars is normal for him now. And then you look at people who grow up in this type of environment. They grow up in an environment where they are showered with blessings. The more they're showered, the less they take pleasure in these blessings. And you see this all the time. People who are growing up and their parents just give them everything. Their parents just hand them everything. Usually they're amongst the most depressed people that you will come across. So this person, did he catch up with the dunya? Yes, it seems as though he caught up with the objects of the dunya. But he didn't technically catch up with the dunya itself, because the whole point of these objects was the pleasure that he was going to derive from them. Whereas the reality is, his pleasure, yes, maybe temporarily for a little bit, the first day or two, the first week or two, the first couple of months, things are different. He's excited. But the moment he goes back to normal, then his normal and the normal of another person become almost the same thing many times. And of course, we're not referring to someone who's struggling heavily, who can't even fulfill his basic needs. That's a separate situation. Yes, someone who's not able to fulfill his basic needs, this person is in hardship. But we're setting that aside right now. We're talking about a person who runs after the dunya, meaning that he loses sleep over the dunya every night, and the one who puts in his effort and is able to fulfill his basic needs, but he doesn't lose sleep over it, lose sleep over it, during nighttime, and he doesn't stay up worried about it, and he's not willing to do haram to get his hands on the dunya. When you compare these two, his normal and his normal is the same amount of pleasure. And yes, his normal is 1 car and his normal is 10 cars. But that doesn't matter anymore. That's not what matters. What matters is the pleasure they derive from these two is the same. And then this one who has 1 car actually might even get excited more. He might even take more pleasure when he gets his 2nd car than the other one, because this other one, he needs an extra 10 cars for him to get excited, whereas this one, he just needs an extra car. He just needs 1 more. If he has 1 more car in his life, what happens? All of a sudden, it's like they gave him the world. They gave him everything. So when you run after the dunya runs away from you. It doesn't mean that you can't get your hands on these objects. No, you can do that. There's no doubt about that. Muawiyah had his hands on a lot of objects when he was alive. Muawiyah, initially he started out and Sham was in his hands and he was in power. Then after the peace treaty with Imam al-Hassan, what happened? Iraq came into his hands as well. And Imam al-Hassan came from the capital of his father, which was in Kufa. He then returned back to Medina. Look at now the power that Muawiyah has, the authority that Muawiyah has. He had a lot of stuff. But did he live a life where it was a pleasurable life for him? No. Because as much as he had, he still wanted more. And everything that he had was the normal for him. And in fact, because his normal was set at such a high level, new things were not even pleasurable for him. They were not even, it wouldn't even make a difference for him anymore. Whereas you and me, if we live a normal lifestyle, and then the smallest things happen in our lifestyle. Yes, I get an extra car, for example, or I'm able to, upgrade my house just by a little bit, just basic. Then what happens? Then I feel like they gave me the world, right? And so many times you extract more pleasure from the little that you have compared to the one who has a lot, because the one who has a lot, it loses its value in his hands. And it's not his fault necessarily. That's just how the dunya is. That's just what the dunya is. That's why when we go to Quran and Hadith, we had so many sayings from Hadith and Quran telling us over and over again that, listen, this dunya, it presents itself like it's a big deal. It's not, though. You got to call out the dunya's bluff. That's what you have to do. It's bluffing. And if you call out its bluff, then you'll know that this dunya, it doesn't have as much importance as people give to it. The Hadith of the Prophet says this. When they asked him about the dunya, he said this. He said, you know what the dunya is like? He was using an analogy. He said, have you ever come across an ocean, a sea? Yes, we've come across an ocean or sea. He said, now take your finger and dip your finger in the sea and then take it out. How much water stays on your finger when you take it out? That amount of water which remains on your finger when you took it out is the dunya, compared to the next world, which is that sea that you see in front of you. This is why, because whatever you get in this dunya, it loses its value so quickly That now the person who has less might even take more pleasure in this world than the one who supposedly has more. Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad wa ajjil farajahum. Knowing this, now we come to the idea that if I know how little the dunya has value, then how is this going to affect, number one, myself? And then number two, the way that I treat others, the way that I deal with others. As it relates to myself, because now I understand how small the value of the dunya is, now I understand that my value compared to the dunya is not the same. In other words, it's not a fair sale for me to sell my soul to this dunya, because this dunya is not a value in return for who I am. If I truly understood that the value of the dunya is small, then I'm not going to sell myself to this dunya. And that's why when they asked the fourth Imam, salawatullahi wasalamu alayhi, this is the fifth Imam, وَقِيلَ لَهُ, and someone asked him, alayhi salam, مَنْ أَعْدَمُ النَّاسِ قَدْرًا, who is the person who has the most value in your eyes? Who's the most valuable person in your eyes? Take a look at what the fifth Imam said. He said, مَنْ لَمْ يَرَ الدُّنْيَا خَطَرًا لِنَفْسِهِ. He said, whoever doesn't see the dunya as a value for himself. The most valuable person in my eyes is the one who doesn't see the dunya as a value in his eyes. Doesn't see the dunya as a value in return of his soul, in lieu of his soul. The more he puts the dunya down in his eyes, the higher his value goes in my eyes, is what the fifth Imam is saying. They asked him, who's the most valuable person? The one who sees the dunya as having the least value. This person has the greatest value. Why? Because when he lessens the value of this dunya in his eyes, then the value of the akhirah goes up in his eyes. Then he does the things he's supposed to do in this world. And they asked the fifth Imam in a separate hadith. The first hadith was from the fourth Imam. By mistake, I'd mentioned the fifth Imam. But this hadith, the second hadith, is from the fifth Imam. وَقِيلَ لَهُ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامُ مَنْ أَعْدَمُ النَّاسِ قَدْرًا. Who's the one who carries the more honor in your eyes? He said, مَنْ لَا يُبَالِي فِي يَدِ مَنْ كَانَتِ الدُّنْيَا. The one who doesn't care who the dunya, or who's in control of the dunya today. What does he mean by that? He's not talking about not caring about what's happening around you. It's not what he's saying at all. He's saying the one who doesn't worry about who's rich, who's poor, who's famous today, who's not famous today, who are people speaking and saying good things about, and who are people speaking and saying bad things. He doesn't worry about this stuff. He doesn't care who is now in the spotlight, which is the exact opposite of what the culture and society living in this country teaches us, which is that the moment you become famous, the moment you get the clicks, and the moment you get the followers, and the moment you become that celebrity, and the moment you go viral, now you're valuable. It's the exact opposite of what Quran and Hadith are teaching us. The fifth Imam said, "Man la yubali ad-dunya fi yadi man kanat ad-dunya." He doesn't care who's having, his viral moments right now. It doesn't matter for him, because the whole thing isn't worth much anyways. So if I see the dunya as not having so much value, then when it comes to myself, I'm going to value myself much higher than what the dunya is able to offer to me. And that's why you find in that famous hadith of Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wasalamu alayhi, he is narrated to have mentioned that you all should never sell yourselves to anything lower than heaven. You are worth more than to sell yourself to anything less than heaven. If you understand that the dunya isn't the value that you are worth, then you are not to sell yourself to this dunya. Question, how do I sell myself to this dunya? It's easy. When you sin, you are selling yourself to this dunya. Some of us think that when we talk about selling our soul to the Satan or to the devil, we're talking about all of a sudden becoming a person who's a monster. Yes, that's one example of it. Sinning are smaller forms of selling your soul to the devil. When the marja says this is haram, this is a red line, if you cross it, God is going to have a problem with you. When he says this is haram, then that means when you do this, you are selling your soul to the devil. Granted, at a smaller extent compared to someone who's a tyrant and someone who his whole life is a monster. This is at a smaller extent. But it's of the same nature and of the same essence. And that's why we've mentioned before multiple times, and I'll reiterate this, that if I want to make sure that I highly value myself, when shaitan comes knocking on my door to sin, to do something that my marja' says it is haram, that means that's the moment where I have to say no to him, which means I'm saying no to selling my soul to the devil. Selling your soul to the devil doesn't just mean becoming a murderer. Yes, that's one very obvious form of it. But everything else that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considers a sin and considers haram, that is also a form of selling yourself, selling your authority, the power you have over your nafs to the devil. When the shaitan comes, knocks on my door and says, why don't you just backbite a little bit? Yes? Why don't you just share this secret about this person's life with others? This is shaitan asking me to sell my soul to him. When I do something haram, I am selling myself to shaitan. And if as long as I am doing that, as long as my life has sins in it, brothers and sisters, I will never be able to elevate myself fully. I will never be able to grow spiritually. If you want to grow spiritually, if you want to build a connection with God, the only way to do it, is to figure out what sins you're committing and to eradicate them, which is very difficult to do. And it's a process. But this is why we have these teachings in Quran and Hadith, that you're supposed to do muhasabah every night. You're supposed to sit back and see what you did and what you didn't do. Throughout the day, you're supposed to have muraqabah. You're supposed to watch yourself. This is how you build spirituality. Spirituality is not built with one-off acts of worship. Oh, just do this one salat, then all of a sudden you become beloved in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, you will be rewarded for that one salat. But then when you sin, you ruin the reward of that one salat. You ruin the spirituality that you have built with it. The only way to grow from a spiritual perspective, the only way, is to remove those sins from my life. If I remove haram habits from my life, then even the smallest good deeds that I do, they will elevate me. They will take me up. They will show their results far more than a person who mixes his good deeds with his bad deeds together and often. And this is a concept we've talked about before, but you will hear me talking about this over and over again. Because we can talk about one-off acts of worship. We can talk about the a'mal of this day and the a'mal of that day, which are all wonderful and important and good, and we should do them. But true spirituality comes with hard work. And that hard work is figuring out what haram habits you have and eradicating them. So this is all a form of me saying no to shaitan when he comes to buy my soul. When he comes and he asks me to sell my soul to him and I say no to him. This all comes from me understanding that the dunya doesn't have any value. This is how it relates to myself. How does it relate now to people that I see around myself? I'll share one hadith in this regard, and inshallah we'll move on to the ahkam and we'll end. As it relates to other people, now because I know the dunya isn't too important, when it comes to people who are blessed with the dunya, and that's the only thing they're blessed with. They're not blessed with the spirituality. They're not blessed with being people close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Their only value is that they're famous. Their only value is that they're popular. Their only value is that they are rich and wealthy. Because what they possess has no value, then they themselves also are not going to become too valuable for me. It doesn't mean you disrespect them. It just means that they're not too valuable now. And the Quran has made this clear in its verses when it comes to the Prophet sallallahu wasallam alayhi. Because the verses of the Quran, they speak about this. They speak of this idea that, Ya Rasulullah, when you look at yourself and the people around you, when you look at yourself coming from the tribe of Quraysh, amongst this tribe you will find some who are not too wealthy, who are struggling, who have difficulties with sometimes the basic needs of their family. And then you will find those who have so much wealth they don't even know what to do with it. Like the Abu Sufyans and the Abu Lahabs of the world and many other examples of that sort. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet, understand that what we gave them, because it has no value, they themselves also, they don't have much value either. And so when you come across them, and this is the teaching that the Quran teaches the Prophet, but of course is teaching us, because we know the Prophet, he's already doing this. But the Quran is teaching us. The Quran says, listen, when you know what they have has no value, their wealth, their fame, their popularity, their beauty even might even be anything that they haven't worked for, anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not value in the akhirah, it only has value here. When you come across people like this, don't sit there and stare at what they have with regrets. What does this mean? I come across somebody who has, this wonderful car, for example. And then deep down, what am I feeling in my heart? Oh, I wish I had that car. If only I had that car. And sometimes you'll see this in family gatherings. People, they come, they get together. Maybe if they get together in the house of someone who's a little bit wealthier, what do people sit down and talk about? And this is a session and a lecture we'll have separately. I'm already planning it out because I know it's such an important topic to discuss. When they get together, they start discussing what comes up. What's amongst the first things that come up? Wow, look at, did you see his house? You see his car? Did you see the front lawn? How much do you think he paid for this? How much do you think he paid for that? Now, outside of the fact that this is a bit annoying, outside of that, the Quran is saying, listen, if you're just talking about it, that's one thing. It's not the best thing, but that's okay if you're just talking about it. The Quran is saying, listen, don't sit there and talk about it with regrets. It's one thing to say, oh, they had a big house. It's another thing to say, oh, they had a big house. I wish I had something like that. If only I had, that much money. If only I had that much fame. If only I had that much popularity. What does the Quran tell the Prophet? Salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. Verse 131 from Surah Taha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet. First, He's telling them, when you come across these rich people, because we know most of the people who joined the message of the Prophet, at least initially, they were amongst the poor people. They were amongst the people who were, amongst the lower classes of society. And so the Quran is telling the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, when they cause problems for you, they cause trouble for you, فَاصْبِرْ عَلَى مَا يَقُولُونَ. Be patient with what they say. And the way to be patient, وَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ قَبْلَ طُلُوعِ الشَّمْسِ وَقَبْلَ غُرُوبِهَا. If you want to be patient, you have to remember us. You have to do tasbih of us. If you don't remember us, if you don't bring us into the equation, you're not going to be able to be patient. If you want help with your mental concerns, your worries, you have to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what the verse is saying, verse 130. And then the verse 100 moves on to this, and he says this, وَلَا بِهِ أَزْوَاجَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. And when you come across some of them, who it seems as though they are fully blessed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given this person everything, given beauty and fame and wealth and popularity and friends and relationships and opportunities and everything. وَلَا تَمُدَّنَّ عَيْنَيْكَ. Don't sit there and stare at them with regrets and you wishing and pleading that I wish I had this. Don't do this. Why? Because this is Zahrat al-Hayat al-Dunya. Zahra, some say it refers to something that's blossoming. You know how flowers, they blossom, but what happens after they blossom? Immediately after they blossom and this flower is showing its beauty for a little bit, then what happens? This flower, all of a sudden, it's not there anymore. It starts to die immediately afterwards. The moment it's blossoming, it's extremely beautiful. But a couple moments later, a couple days later, a couple weeks later, it's not even there anymore. The Quran says, listen, these are like the blossoms of the dunya. They look very good in that moment, but they are not there. They're not permanent though. They're temporary. Before you know it, it's gone. Zahrat al-Hayat al-Dunya. Don't sit there and just say, I wish I had this, I wish I had that. You look at the lifestyle of another person and you just say, wow, this person, the moment he says something, there's thousands of people who give importance to what he says because he's so popular, because he's so famous. Sometimes you see this with celebrities. This person might say the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard. But then you find people repeating it, speaking of it, giving importance to it, and people sit there and say, oh, I wish. And this is what you had with Qarun as well. Qarun, the people around Qarun, what does the Quran say about them? The Quran says that they used to sit there, they used to say, I wish we had what Qarun had. The Quran is saying, وَلَا تَمُدَّنَّ عَيْنَيْكَ. Don't sit there and stare at what we have given some of them. زَهْرَةَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. By the way, what we have given them, لِنَفْتِنَهُمْ فِيهِ. They don't understand. We gave them all of this to test them. It's not just like a free trial. This is a test. A test in the sense that you'll have to answer for what you are given. It's not like it's just free, you just take it and do whatever you want to do with it. No, we're going to ask them about the wealth that we gave them. We're going to ask them about the popularity that they had. How did they use that popularity? We're going to ask them about their beauty, the beauty that we gave them. Did they use it in the proper way or did they use it in haram ways? Right? We're going to ask them about all of this. لِنَفْتِنَهُمْ فِي. This is all to test them. وَالرِّزْقُ رَبِّكَ خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى. And what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in mind for you, khayrun, it's better. It's a higher level of pleasure, وَأَبْقَى, and it's permanent. Quantity and quality is more with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prepared for you. There are more teachings that have to do with this topic. We'll leave it for next Thursday. That if I understand how little the dunya has value for me, how will this reflect on the way I treat those who only have the dunya, who only work for the dunya, who only value the dunya? And how this contrasts with the common culture that we find around us today. And then on the flip side, when I come across someone who doesn't have any dunya, he has no one around him, he has no name, he has no fame, he has no wealth, but he's a good person. What am I supposed to do? And how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests us with a person like this. And a story from the life of the Prophet salawatullahi wasalamu alayhi, in terms of how he was tested with some of his companions who did not have much wealth. And what type of a test Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did for him using that group of his friends. I want to move on to the ahkam portion for tonight. And inshallah we'll be wrapping up very soon. We were talking about the invalidators of prayer. The next invalidator, the next mubtil of prayer is anything that you do that will leave you the state and the form of prayer. You know, when we pray, it has a particular form. If someone were to walk by you and they see you praying, they would immediately, if they're Muslim, they would immediately recognize that you are praying. There's a particular way you do it. You wouldn't be talking, you wouldn't be jumping up and down. Therefore, anything that I do that goes against this state and this form, it will break my prayer. Whatever that might be. Now, this might change with time and culture, and these are things that play a role in it. For example, if I pick up my phone to just turn it off, for example, in my prayer, this is not, when I say picking up, I don't mean picking it up and speaking in salat. I just mean picking it up and turning it off, for example. This is not going to break my salat. Other small movements, this is not going to break my salat. And this is why you find in that famous verse of the Quran, Ali ibn Abi Talib was in salat and he gave away his ring. So this is not going to break my salat. If I do something that is unusual, it's unnormal or abnormal, and people look at it and they say, oh, this person's not praying anymore, then my salat is going to become batil. For those who have children, maybe the child is crying, you have to pick up the child, you have to give something to the child. None of these are going to break one's salat. We have examples of this when it comes to the life of the Prophet, that even in the Sunni narrations you find that the Prophet, and we have these narrations as well, that the Prophet, first of all, he used to take Hasanain to the masjid with him. And number two, sometimes when he used to go to sajda, they used to climb up on him, and the Prophet would wait for them to come down, and then he would, wake or get up from his sajda, and so on and so forth. So these basic movements, these are not a problem. Gestures also, these are not a problem. Saying things in salat, we talked about this in our previous session, that when I say things in salat, I have to make sure that I'm saying it as a dhikr. I cannot say something, even if the phrase itself is a religious phrase, I cannot say it with the intention of with the intention of trying to convey a point to somebody. So the best thing to do is just stay away from that and just use gestures if that becomes necessary in your prayer. So that's number one. The second invalidator that we want to discuss today, obviously, is eating and drinking. And this, of course, does not relate to those times where you have pieces of food left in the mouth. If someone swallows that food, that's not a problem. As long as you're not chewing on it and playing with it, then that's not going to be a problem. But if someone is chewing gum, for example, yes, this will invalidate their salat at that point. And the final invalidator of prayer that we will discuss are the doubts that someone has when it comes to his salat. And amongst those doubts is the doubts that he has as it relates to the number of the raka'at. This, brothers and sisters, is one of the most misunderstood sections of fiqh. One of the most misunderstood rulings that we have from our maraja. In the sense that many of us deal with this situation where we might be praying and then all of a sudden we don't know which rak'ah we are on. And we assume, and this is because we have been taught this in Sunday schools, growing up, that there's, maybe 50, 60 different options. Did you have a doubt between 2 and 3? Did you have a doubt between 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and so on and so forth? The reality is that just with one principle and one ruling, 95% of these situations will be solved. And so I just want to explain this because this is the ruling that Ayatollah Sistani has, it's the ruling that Ayatollah Khamenei has, Ayatollah Makarim has, and many of our other scholars also, many of our other maraja have this ruling as well. As a general principle, regardless of which prayer you are praying, Fajr, Maghrib, Isha, Dhuhr, Asr, doesn't matter. And regardless of which rak'ah you have doubts about, does not matter. As a general principle, at least for these three maraja that I mentioned, if you have a doubt between two rak'ahs, and there is a greater chance in your mind that the rak'ah you are on is one of these two rak'ahs, meaning that 60% you're thinking, this is my third rak'ah. 60% you're thinking, this is my fourth rak'ah. If you have a higher percentage on one side, and it's not a 50-50 situation, then you take that. That right there, it's a very simple principle, and it solves a lot of the situations that we normally have doubts about. If you don't have that and you sit there, you can even think in your prayer for a second. That's not a problem either. You can take a moment, stop your dhikr, and just think about it for a second. If you think about it and still you don't remember which rak'ah you're on, in the sense that there isn't even a greater chance on one of the two sides, then yes, the other rulings will come into the picture. Whereas, for example, if it's Fajr and Maghrib, your salat is completely batil. If it's Dhuhr or Asr or Isha, then there are different situations. But that's after all of that is after this one basic principle. When you have doubts in prayer, if there's a greater chance on one of the sides of these two doubts that you have, the doubt that you have on both options, if there's a greater percentage on one side, you take that, and that is your salat, and you do not have to do anything else. The last doubt that we will speak of is the doubt that someone has after their salat is done, and they have a doubt about whether they did something correctly or by mistake in their prayer, and so on and so forth. Whenever you have a doubt after the salat is done, that doubt is something you can disregard, and your salat is completely fine. With that, inshallah, I will bring today's talk to an end. I just want to take a moment to see if we have any questions on the YouTube chat. Okay. Assalamu alaikum to everybody who said salam. I don't see any questions here, so we should be fine. Let's take a moment before we end, inshallah, to recite Surah Fatiha for all of our marhumin and marhumat with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen ar-Rahman ar-Rahim Maliki yawmiddin Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim Ghayri al-maghdubi alayhim wa lad-dallin.